Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 31, The Barrister.
This episode is on William Ah Ket. He was the first Chinese-Australian barrister in Australia. He fought against the White Australia policy and racist laws that targeted Chinese workers. I came across William Ah Ket in my family tree research as his son, William Mark Ah Ket, married the granddaughter of my great-grandparents, Philip and Matilda Bayliss. Much to my delight, one night last year, I was listening to one of my favourite podcast series, and the story of William Ah Ket was presented. There has been a lot of research done by William's descendants, and I acknowledge the research that has been placed online that I have utilised in part for this episode. William Ah Ket was born in 1876 in the northeastern Victorian town of Wangaratta. He was one of 8 children and the only son, so no doubt treasured as the longed-for male. His father, Ah Ket, had arrived in Australia in the 1850s from southern China in the gold rush fever from the Siyup region in Guangdong province in southern China, and his mother arrived in the 1860s. His mother was Hing Ung, and she had bound feet and spoke no English. The family spent time at the Buckland Chinese camp near Bright in Victoria, and 5 of the daughters, Margaret, Rose, Lillian, Blanche and Matilda, were born there between 1865 and 1874. During the late 1850s, the Buckland Mining Division, where Bright is now located, had one of the highest Chinese populations in the colony, outnumbering Europeans by 5 to 1. This stimulated an anti-Chinese sentiment which led to violence, including the Buckland Riot in 1857 and the Moses Creek Riot in 1859. In response, the Victorian government established segregated Chinese camps. The Buckland camp was to eventually comprise of stores, a joss house, hotel, cook shops, gambling dens, lottery houses, a bootmaker, opium dens, a Presbyterian church and even a Chinese circus. In the late 19th century, the camp fell into decline, and by the early 20th century, there was only one descendant living at the camp. The Joss House was demolished around 1915, and in 1982 all the remaining buildings were demolished. By 1876 the family had moved to Wangaratta. William's father, Ah Ket, was one of Australia's earliest tobacco farmers, and he also owned a shop that sold various supplies including opium. Father and son also worked as court interpreters in their spare time, and Ah Ket employed a Chinese tutor for the children. William's mother, Hing Ung, was sent to the Beechworth Lunatic Asylum and was diagnosed with mania when William was only 5 in 1881. The youngest child, Ada, was born in January 1881, so it's quite likely that Hing Ung suffered from postnatal depression. She was an inmate there for the remainder of her life. Dr. Sophie Couchman, who specialises in Chinese Australian history, said that this was a time when Chinese people were moving out of the goldfields and competing with Anglo-Australians in other industries such as furniture manufacturing for the first time. She says there was definitely a fresh wave of discrimination that was being put in place. In the mid-1880s, the colonies decided they were no longer going to naturalise Chinese, and then in 1903 that was enshrined in federal legislation. William Ah Ket at this time was in his teens, and he's being brought up to be a smart, educated young man, and he would have seen all of this going on. It took quite a time for the Ah Kets to be accepted in the town of Wangaratta. Ah Ket chose for his family to become parishioners of the Methodist Church, so the town people got to know them. However, there is an example of the racism the family experienced in an article I found in January 1889. Albury. 4 intelligent and respectful native-born Chinese children, the oldest being a girl of 14, were stopped on the arrival of the afternoon train from Melbourne by Mr. Joyce, the sub-collector, for entering the colony without naturalisation papers. In answer to the customs officer, the girls said that they were the children of Ah Ket, an interpreter of Wangaratta, where they were born and educated, and that they were going to visit their sister. Mrs. R. Sam at Gerodgery. She understood that native-born children were free to go anywhere in Australia. The customs officer thought otherwise, but instead of giving them in charge, he sent them back on the same train to Victoria. It is the opinion of the magistrates here that the law is not meant to apply to native-born children and that the officer should have allowed the children to go on their journey. The sisters were skilled dressmakers and 3 of them opened a tea house in Wangaratta. So I'm just going to talk about the sisters firstly before I go into detail about William. The oldest, Margaret, was born on the 21st of June 1865 at the Bucklands Chinese camp at Bright. She married Ah Yon in Wangaratta in August 1883 at the age of 18. Yu was known as William in Australia and was born in China in 1884. William farmed at Edie in Victoria, and Margaret and William had 9 children. Margaret died in June 1929 in Brunswick, Victoria, aged 63. Rose, also known as Susie Lin, was born on the 7th of August 1868 at the Buckland Chinese Camp Bright. She married Sam Ah Yuk, a draper in Wangaratta, in April 1885. Rose was 16 when they married. Sam and Rose lived in Gerodgery, north of Albury, who was mentioned earlier in the article, Condobolin and Sydney. Rose and Sam had 5 children, and Rose died at Tambaroora, New South Wales, in October 1927, aged 59. One of Rose and Sam's daughters, Ivy, was also a dressmaker like her aunts. She married William San Sung Fong in Sydney in 1916. They had 4 children, and one of them, Gwen, later becoming a doctor. Ivy died in Springvale, Victoria in 1928, aged only 38. I'm just going to read a couple of articles in relation to Ivy's death. Fatal car accident. A sad fatality occurred at the railway bridge on Melbourne Road between Dandenong and Springvale at about 5 p.m. on Sunday. Mr. and Mrs. William Fong of Wattletree Road, Malvern, with their 4 young children, were returning home in a car after having a day in the country. Mr. Fong was driving the car, and when going down a slight hill, he put on the brakes. A shower of rain, which fell earlier in the afternoon, had made the road slippery, and the car skidded and fell over a small embankment. Mrs. Fong was thrown clear, but fell on her head, her neck being broken, and she died before medical aid could be obtained. Mr. Fong and the children escaped with slight bruises. Within a few minutes of the accident, about 100 cars gathered around and greatly interfered with the work of the ambulance, which had been sent from Melbourne to take Mrs. Fong's body to the morgue. And another article outlining the inquest says, Chinese breaks down at inquest. Wife killed when car skidded. When he entered the witness box at the morgue today to give evidence concerning the death of his wife, Ivy Fong, 38, in a motor car accident at Springvale on April the 15th, William Fong, a Chinese fruit merchant, broke down. Later he told the deputy coroner that at 2:15 p.m. on April the 15th, while driving his car containing his wife, 3 children and a friend along Princess Highway, Springvale, the wheels skidded on a bad patch of road and the car overturned. His wife was thrown out and killed almost instantly. Mr. Grant, in recording the finding of accidental death, said that he hoped the municipality concerned would realise the dangerous state of that portion of the road where the fatality had occurred and have it mended. The 3rd child of Ah Ket was Lillian, and she was born on the 16th of August 1870 at Buckland Chinese Camp in Bright. She died at the age of only 14 in Wangaratta on the 4th of July 1884. Blanche was born on the 7th of October 1882 at Buckland Chinese Camp Bright. Family trees have mixed information on her death. Either 1883 in Tambaroora, New South Wales is recorded, or the 4th of July 1884 in Wangaratta, aged 11. Matilda, the 5th child, was born on the 10th of June 1874 at Buckland Chinese Camp Bright. Matilda was a dressmaker and married William Hon Hing in April 1904 in Wangaratta when she was 29 and William was 35. They had 4 children, and Matilda died in Brunswick, Victoria in October 1930, aged 56. The 7th child was Alberta, and she was born in Wangaratta on the 27th of January 1879. She was known as Birdie and was also a dressmaker. She married Timothy Kang In Young, a fruit merchant in Victoria in 1907. They had one son, Roy, in 1910, and Alberta died aged only 35 in Brunswick in November 1914. And the last child of the family, Ada Evangeline, was born on the 26th of January 1881 in Wangaratta. She was the only daughter to have married a non-Chinese man, Ralph Godden, in Wangaratta in March 1902 at the Methodist Church. She was 21 and Ralph was 25. Ralph was a train engine driver. They had 3 children. Ada died in June 1911 in Brunswick, aged only 30, and Ralph remarried in 1917. Now going back to William. William Ah Ket moved to Melbourne in 1893. In the matriculation book at Melbourne University, it notes William's grasp of languages, Greek, Latin, English and French, on top of the Chinese language that he had spoken in the family and at which he'd been educated in the Chinese classics by the private tutor engaged by his father. Indeed, as part of his advocacy in court, William was renowned for citing quotations from Shakespeare, Robbie Burns and Gilbert and Sullivan. William was a renowned advocate and orator. Indeed, there is evidence to suggest that Sir Robert Menzies modelled his oratory skills after William. William completed an arts degree at Melbourne University from 1893 to 1897. In preparing for his legal career, William had 2 possible options to choose from. One was to pursue the Bachelor of Law, or LLB. The other option, that was cheaper and quicker, was to undertake the Article Clerks course. In 1897, William chose the Article Clerks course over the more expensive and time-consuming Bachelor of Law. Those who completed the Bachelor of Law tended to come from affluent backgrounds. Although the Bachelor of Law had a high status, many prominent barristers and judges at the time were educated through the Article Clerks course. William's mother died in 1896 of tuberculosis in the Beechworth Lunatic Asylum, aged only 51, and Ah Ket died only 5 days after his wife at the age of 60, reportedly in a newspaper article of dying of a broken heart. In 1898, William joined Maddock and Jamieson, as Maddox it was known as then, and completed the Article Clerks course in 1899. He then undertook his articles of clerkship from 1900 to 1903 and was admitted to practice in May 1903. He received a prize in 1902, some 3 years after he completed the Article Clerks course. An article is outlining William's acceptance of the prize. A successful law student, Mr. William Ah Ket, who successfully qualified as a barrister and solicitor at the recent law examination and was awarded the Supreme Court prize of £40, a coveted distinction, is a full-blooded, clever young Chinese, only son of the late Ah Ket, an old and esteemed resident of the Wangaratta district. Ah Ket's paternal wish was that William should qualify for the law in his countrymen's interest, and with this object in view, secured a Chinese tutor for his youthful son, with the result that the hero of the recent law examinations was acting as an interpreter with success in court cases in which his countrymen were involved early in his teens and had a Chinese education suitable for all practical purposes. Mr. William Ah Ket's sisters have a local reputation as expert needlewomen, and on several occasions swept the board in the needlework sections of the district shows. Ah Ket's attachment to his family was a household word about Wangaratta, where he acted as an advisor general to a large colony of Chinese engaged in tobacco and hop growing, and his demise, which took place a couple of days after the death of his wife, a full-blooded Chinese lady, was generally attributed to a broken heart. William was formally admitted to the Victorian Bar in 1904. He broke social barriers when he signed the bar roll and built a reputation as a skilled barrister. Reynard Tang, the founding president of the Australian Asian Lawyers Association, said, "Given the Commonwealth only formed in 1901, you wouldn't expect someone of Chinese descent within a few years of that to have been admitted. That's even before we had female lawyers coming into the profession. That in itself was an impressive feat." If you think about someone who's a first-generation Australian trying to break into a white Anglo-Saxon dominated legal profession, it would have taken a fair bit of work to build up his reputation, get to be known and respected. And on top of that work, William also had to deal with racism. His great-granddaughter, Blossom Ah Ket, recalls a family story of a white Australian man taunting William on a train on the way to court. The man was asking him how the Chinaman likes his cups of tea. On arriving at the court, William realised that the man who had teased him was the lawyer he was up against. William won the case that day and went over afterwards and put on a stereotypical Chinese accent and said, "How you likey my cross-examination." William specialised in civil cases, including lawsuits over divorce petitions, wills and contracts. In one case, Potter versus Minahan, it involved a man called Minahan who was born of a Chinese father and a European mother in 1876, and this was coincidentally the same year in which William was born. Minahan resided in Victoria until 5 years old, when he moved to China and lived with his father in his father's village, until his father's death 20 years later in 1896. Minahan subsequently returned to Victoria in 1907, but failed the notorious dictation test and was charged by a customs officer with being a prohibited immigrant. According to the law report, evidence was given by the customs officer administering the dictation test, and he told the defendant he was going to read out to him a passage of no less than 50 words in English, and that he required him to write them out in English, and that he said, "Here is paper and pencil for that purpose. If you write them, you will be allowed to land. If you fail to write them, you will not be allowed to land. I will read the passage slowly, and if you say you can write it, I will read it out slowly again." He then read a passage and asked the defendant if he could write it, and the defendant, through an interpreter, said he could not. The question that fell to be determined was whether the Act was intended to apply to Australian-born subjects who would normally enjoy the right of entry. The question was decided in favour of Minahan, and on the basis that the Act was not intended to apply to Australian-born subjects who were British subjects by virtue of being born within a British dominion such as Australia. As Duffy, KC and Ah Ket argued, it is improbable that the legislature would take away this right except by express words or necessary implication. Their argument was accepted by the High Court. Though the law was not dismantled until the 1970s, it was a significant case at the time when there were active political attempts to limit Chinese immigration to Australia. It's about a person's right to identity in the place they were born, so it was pretty important that the case was won. He was also active in political groups which lobbied on behalf of the Chinese Australian community against the legal supply of opium and the laws which imposed restrictions on Chinese laundry workers and furniture makers. The Victorian Parliament eventually abandoned the proposed changes to the laws known as the Factory Acts, which would have made such restrictions more stringent. Dr. Couchman said that the changes that Williams spoke out against were very invasive. They were really pretty abhorrent, and if nobody had stood up like William Ah Ket to protest against them, then they might have passed. There was a case, Ingham versus Healy at, and this was an issue in this case, and it was the interpretation of Section 42 of the Act, which prohibited persons at Chinese factories from working on any day during certain prohibited hours. In this case, the owner of a Chinese laundry had been charged with an offence for permitting a lodger to iron a shirt during the prohibited hours. Ah Ket in the Supreme Court of Victoria, and subsequently MacArthur and Ah Ket in the High Court of Australia, successfully argued that the lodger had in fact been ironing his own shirt, and this wasn't an offence under the Act, as it did not constitute work that was ordinarily done in the factory within the terms of the legislation. Sir Arthur Dean, in his Multitude of Counsellors, A History of the Victorian Bar in 1968, said, "Willie Ah Ket was the only man of Chinese origin to practice at the bar. He was a very capable and popular man and enjoyed a good general sense in common law. He had a quiet, shrewd disposition and was a keen, if not successful, punter. He acquired a reputation as a negotiator of settlements, being persuaded that in general his clients would be wiser to come to terms with their opponents rather than incur the risks and expense of litigation, but not every client was wise enough to accept such advice." And Sir Robert Menzies, in his biography, mentioned William Ah Ket. He said, "William Ah Ket did not ever sit on the bench, though he would have been a very competent judge. He was a phenomenon at the Victoria Bar, a full-blooded Chinese-born in the northeast of Victoria. He was a sound lawyer and a good advocate. His bland oriental features gave nothing away. His keen sense of fun was concealed behind an almost immovable mask. A certain prejudice amongst clients against having a Chinese barrister to an extent limited his practice, though instructing solicitors thought very well of him. He was considerably senior to me, but we were great friends. William married Gertrude Victoria Bullock on the 16th of November 1912 at the Methodist Church in Kew, after courting her for 4 years before her father would accept him. Initially, Gertrude's father banned William from the Bullock family home. Gertrude was a typist, and it was her boss who finally convinced Gertrude's father to give William a chance. Gertrude was 11 years younger than William and born in Clifton Hill in 1887, and they'd met at a church picnic. She was of Scottish descent and was 25 when she married William. Just before their marriage, there was an article in the paper on the 12th of November 1912, and it says, First Chinese Parliament, Australia's delegate. Mr. William Ah Ket, barrister, has been chosen as representative for Victoria, indeed practically of Australia, as delegate to the Overseas Conference to be held at Pekin on the 10th of December in connection with the Chinese Parliament, which is to assemble at Pekin early next year. This is in pursuance of a cable message received on the 28th of October by Mr. Yang Huang, Consul General for China, from the Chinese Embassy in London. There will be 6 delegates selected by ballot by the conference and representing the interests of Chinese living outside China. The selected delegates will reside in China at least during the sittings of the Parliament. The latter will consist of an upper and lower house and will be essentially British in character. It will have approximately 850 members, of whom 700 will be in the lower house. Mr. Ah Ket, who will leave Melbourne at the end of this week for Sydney en route for China, will, prior to sailing, be married to Miss Bullock, who resides at Kew. And this was a report after their trip to China. Railways in China. One of the things that most favourably impressed Mr. William Ah Ket, a Melbourne barrister, during his visit to China was the excellent railway system now in operation there. He says that the first-class carriages on the line from Shanghai to Pekin were beautifully upholstered and scrupulously clean. This service is offered by British people, among whom are quite a number of Australians. Even the purely Chinese-controlled lines could, he declared, show a few points to some of the Australian systems. He experienced some difficulty in making himself understood in Peking. He speaks the Cantonese dialect fluently, but the Peking dialect is different, and at the convention, the services of an interpreter were often required to enable him to follow the debates. He says that the up-to-date information possessed by the Chinese government as to Australian affairs is quite surprising. And on the 29th of April 1913, Gertrude had an article in the newspaper. It says, Women in China Through Australian Eyes, Mrs. William Ah Ket. Instead of having her honeymoon tour in the Blue Mountains or in the Buffalo Ranges, Mrs. William Ah Ket accompanied her husband to China, where he held an important official position at the Pekin Conference. With him she returned to Melbourne on Saturday after an absence of almost 6 months. I think, said Mrs. Ah Ket, the first thing that strikes one about the Chinese woman in her own home is that she is kind, gentle and unassuming. She is the direct antithesis to the modern progressive European woman. Her hobbies appear to be centred in flowers, birds, babies and needlework. Women of all classes are expert seamstresses. They embroider beautifully and make crochet lace. Bachelor women are a rarity in China. Women there do not seek freedom and a latchkey, but settle down early in life, usually between the ages of 16 and 19. A woman of 25 is considered to be a confirmed old maid. They are beginning to taste some of the sweets of emancipation, for now they walk the streets instead of hiding behind the seclusion of a portable chair. They also attend the theatres unchaperoned, however they never go out alone, but always in groups of 2 or 3. The Chinese woman is very curious about the clothes of the European. She thinks they must be most uncomfortable. She will ask you where the stone in your bangle came from. Are there many more feathers like those you are wearing in your hat? And 101 trifling questions of the same character. I heard a little group of them chatting in front of a shop window in which an elaborate evening dress was displayed. One thought that the English woman must be strong to wear that hole in her neck and not catch a cold in the head. Another could not understand why English women did not wear their clothes covered in, while a third little lady expressed an opinion that the window dresser had forgotten to put on all of the model's clothes. Hats are never worn, but great care is bestowed upon the hair, which usually takes 2 to 3 hours to pomade and decorate. They have different sets of headdresses, earrings and bangles, of which they're very proud. House rent is very dear, consequently you find that the flat system is popular. Some of the prices of foodstuffs were amazing in their cheapness. I did not think clothing particularly cheap, but garments were made up for a mere trifle, 3 cents apiece. In domestic labour, houseboys take the place of an English housemaid. A boy who will give good service commands $10 to $20 a month. Being particularly devoted to children, many Chinese women become children's nurses. This attendant is called an amho. Her salary is usually about $8 a month. She is a picturesque figure in the gardens reserved for European children and their nurses. She wears a jumper costume of oriental blue with a large white apron. Her black glossy hair is encased in a net and encircled with braided velvet hand tied in the same fashion of that of a Roman headdress. On the 29th of September 1917, paper mentioned that William Ah Ket of Melbourne has been appointed as Acting Consul General for China in Australia in place of T.R. Seng, who will shortly leave the Commonwealth. In an interview with the National Library of Australia in 1993, his daughter, Toy Lan, remembered her affluent childhood. She said there were maids at the family home and her parents often hosted glamorous mahjong and poker parties for their friends. He played the game of affluence and gambling and carding and living it up, but when it came to the law, he knew very well what it was like to struggle and be poor and oppressed, so his sympathies were always on the side of the underdog. When William was 59, he suffered a stroke and stopped working, and he died in 1936 at the age of 60, with his wife and children by his bedside. His final words to his family were, "Unity is strength." And in the paper, his death was widely publicised, and one such article reads, Mr. William Ah Ket. Mr. William Ah Ket, one of the most popular members of the Victoria Bar, died yesterday. He was born at Wangaratta in 1876. His father was a storekeeper and tobacco grower, and was one of the most highly esteemed men in the Wangaratta district. Mr. William Ah Ket received his early education at Wangaratta, and after matriculating at Melbourne University in the early 1890s, he entered upon a law course. The course was a brilliant one, and in his final year he won the coveted Supreme Court prize and gained the highest total of marks, it is believed, ever obtained in the examination. He served articles with the late Mr. Richard Cross, and after being admitted to the bar in 1903, became managing clerk in the office of Maddock Jamieson Loney. Several years later he resigned his position there and went to the bar. For a time he was associated with the late Mr. W.T. Coldham, who was then one of the most brilliant members of the bar. Mr. Ah Ket soon built up an excellent practice, being briefed in cases in all jurisdictions, in each of which he had a sound knowledge of the law. As a cross-examiner he had few equals at the bar, and in his arguments in court he was clear and convincing. He also excelled as an after-dinner speaker. Of the classics and modern languages, the late Mr. Ah Ket had a deep knowledge. He, however, did not neglect the language of his fathers, and was well versed in both Chinese speech and writing, and on many occasions he had voluntarily acted as an interpreter in court. Mr. Ah Ket was much esteemed by the Chinese community, and on several occasions he had filled the position of acting consul for China in Melbourne. He was a leading member of the Masonic Order. He was a member of the Grand Lodge and a PM of the East Caulfield Lodge. His interest in sport embraced cricket, golf and racing, and he became one of the original members of the Woodlands Golf Club and a member of the VATC. The late Mr. Ah Ket leaves a widow, 2 sons, Mr. William Ah Ket, who's in his 5th year of his medical course at university, and Mr. Stanley Ah Ket, who last year obtained his LLB degree and is now serving his articles with Bullen and Burt solicitors. There are also 2 daughters, Mei Lan and Toy Lan Ah Ket. News of Mr. Ah Ket's death after an illness of short duration was received in legal circles yesterday with deep regret. And another article, Mr. William Ah Ket. Members of the judiciary, the bar and the legal profession were present yesterday afternoon at the chapel of the Springvale Crematorium for the burial service of the late Mr. William Ah Ket. Present in the very large gathering of mourners were members of the Chinese community, Masonic brethren, sporting clubs and personal friends. The hearse and floral car carried many flowers. The chief mourners were Mr. William Ah Ket and Mr. Stanley Ah Ket, his sons. And at the Wangaratta Historical Society, there is a plaque that was placed at the 150th anniversary of the founding of Victoria, and it says, in memory of William Ah Ket, who was born in Wangaratta of Chinese descent and became a prominent Victorian barrister. Educated in both English and Chinese cultures, he agitated against racial intolerance in Victoria and defended the rights of Victoria's Chinese community. So as mentioned, the couple had 4 children, William, Stanley, Mei-lan and Toi-lan. William Mark Ket. William was born in April 1914 in Melbourne. At 22, he completed his medical degree and married Phyllis Louisa Murphy, known to her family as Nan, in 1941. Phyllis was 28 and William 27 when they married. Phyllis was born in Yea and was a nurse at the Prince Henry Hospital, which is likely how she met William, a classic nurse meets doctor. William became Deputy Superintendent of Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital. They had 2 sons, Paul Stanley Joseph Ket, who was an engineer, and Gregory David Charles Ket, who was a publisher. William died in Hawthorne in 1962, aged only 48. Stanley Albert Mark Ket. Stanley did law at Melbourne University and became a solicitor with the firm Pavey, Wilson and Cohen in Collins Street, Melbourne, but was tragically killed during the Second World War. He firstly enlisted on the 12th of March 1941 and stated he completed 2 years in the Melbourne School Cadets, and he did his training at Seymour. He then enlisted again on the 23rd of July 1942 in the field in Queensland when he was 27. He was living with his mother at the time of his enlistment. He arrived at Port Moresby on the 25th of October 1943. Stanley died on the 3rd of May 1945 of accidental injuries from a plane crash, termed in the report as an air crack-up. He received 2nd and 3rd degree burns to both hands, arms, neck, face, back and legs, and was identified by his disc. He was taken to the USS LST on the wharf at the Yellow Beach, Tarakan Island South, and he died on that ship from shock and circulatory collapse, and was buried on the same day at Beach GP Cemetery at Tarakan. The elder daughter, Geraldine Mei-lan Ah Ket, known as Mei-lan, was born in 1918 in Caulfield, Victoria. She had met Len Williams, who had emigrated to Australia from London in the late 1930s and was a musician. They met at a jazz club in Melbourne, and Len recalls that Mei-lan was a devastatingly beautiful lady, and before we married she had been the secretary to the Chinese consul. They shared fairly radical left-wing views and actively supported causes like foreign aid for China and workers' rights. One of their frequent haunts was Melbourne's Speaker's Corner. Len was a pioneer of the guitar in Melbourne. There was no classical guitar scene to speak of before Len arrived. He became popular in dance halls and clubs around Melbourne and held the guitar chair of the ABC dance band, broadcasting regularly, although the job wasn't particularly lucrative. They were said to have married around 1940, but I can't find a record of marriage until 1951. However, census records as early as 1942 state Geraldine with the name Williams. It is quite likely that maybe they married and separated and divorced and then remarried again later on. They had a son, John Christopher Williams, on the 24th of April 1941 in Melbourne, and he is the internationally renowned classical guitarist. He's listed in many places as the greatest guitarist of all time. John gained his own sense of social engagement from his parents. John's childhood as an only child growing up in Melbourne was stimulating, to say the least. His first guitar teacher was his father, and when John was 4, his father gave him his first guitar. Guitars were hard to come by in those days, and Len found a small Martin in the end, breaking up the neck with a plastic wood filler, so it became more a classical guitar than a steel-stringed instrument. John was taught by his father into his early teens, and despite his father's uncompromising and strict approach, his gratitude to his father has always been unstinting. He said, "I think I learnt the most about guitar from my father. He was a great teacher. He wanted to make that beautiful sound, and I spent a lot of time on hand position and being relaxed. He also wanted no unnecessary hand movement. He taught me about control of tone colour, and that technique is not about speed, but his control of dynamics. In 1952, in part because Len had personal ambitions beyond Melbourne, but also because they wanted to give their son John the best opportunities, the family moved to London and sailed on the RMS Orontes off the Orient Line. Len had even had to take an additional job as a hippo keeper at the Melbourne Zoo to fund their move. In London, Len established the Spanish Guitar Centre, a successful school that also presented concerts and masterclasses, which gradually helped build London into a centre of the guitar world. Meilan married again. Her surname was Bunting. She died on the 29th of January 1976 at the John Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford, England. She had earlier returned to Australia and was listed in a census record living in Sydney, and had lived with her sister Toylan, but that hadn't worked out. So with her health deteriorating due to emphysema, she decided to return to England and entered a care home in Somerton, Oxford. William's younger daughter, Margaret Toylan Ah Ket, known as Toylan, was born on the 30th of October 1920 in Caulfield. She married Thomas Edmund Allen, a bank clerk, in December 1942 in St Kilda. Thomas was a pilot officer in the RAAF at the time of their marriage, and they married at the All Saints Church. They lived at Westmead in New South Wales in 1963, where Thomas was a research officer at this time. Toylan has spent many dedicated years of her life researching her father's life. She was a foundation member of the Chinese Australian Historical Society, very active in its early years, and was later honoured as a life member. She completed an honours degree at Sydney University with a thesis on the adaptation of Chinese religion in Australian society, and she died in 2015 at the age of 94. In his more than 30-year career, William Ah Ket was never promoted to the rank of a senior barrister nor an appointed judge. In the biography of Joan Rosenov, QC, Isabel Carter recounts the time when William said to Joan, "You and I have both chosen the wrong profession, Joan. We will never satisfy our ambitions. Neither of us will ever be made a judge because you are a woman. Because I am Chinese. We should have done medicine." Mr. Tang says it shows that despite his talents, he suffered from a level of discrimination. He probably would have seen people that were junior to him progress past him in that career, and of course that would have been disappointing to see that and not be afforded the same opportunities of everyone else. A scholarship has been made in honour of William. It was established in 2017 by the Asian Australian Lawyers Association and sponsored by Maddox. The aim of the scholarship is to encourage final year law students, law graduates and lawyers in the early stages of their career to contribute to the development and promotion of cultural diversity in the legal sector. In an address in 2019, Chief Justice Kiefel stated, "His answers to the difficulties he faced appears to have been to succeed in what he did, to be a real part of the legal profession, to help others, and to act at all times righteously, with courage and with kindness. That's why his story is so important." In closing, a quote from William Ah Ket. "Having carefully improved himself, a man may bend his mind to improving others, and by the force of example as well as precept help to make the world a better and happier place." If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.